Hello, everyone. Welcome to my sixth generation little retrospective here. What you're seeing here is I'm going to be playing many of these games on an emulator. Maybe I'll do a little casual video on emulators themselves. Nothing too much of a deep dive, just kind of more of a very beginner, right? For people that are looking into getting into emulation and just kind of need a understanding of like what emulators are and such, and probably some of the more recommended ones for specific systems. Um, there's tons of great videos out there that really help me out to get set up. Um, but this is not what this is. So it's just the way I have access to a lot of these games nowadays. Um, just for the majority of the games that I have on here, I at one point owned them. And especially with the sixth generation, I would say that if I still had all my collection of games that I used to have, every game that I've ever purchased, if I never got rid of them, I would have had a pretty massive collection. Maybe not quite like on some videos that I've seen, where it's just a huge, collection of games, but it would have been pretty big though. Um, but through various reasons, I had to get rid of most of them. And so I've gone back and just acquired these games by various means. But again, most of these games that I have on here, for the most part, I've played through them to some extent, and I've owned several of them. There's a handful here and there that I gotten that I just, for games that just aren't easily accessible anymore. But for the most part, I did own most of the majority of these games. We're going to start with the PlayStation 2. I already made a video on the Dreamcast, and in my opinion, I do think that the Dreamcast is definitely in the sixth generation. I already made my video on it, dedicated towards it. My intention was to do like an overall sixth gen video, including the Dreamcast, but I kind of got sidetracked and I did the Dreamcast video on its own. So that's kind of its own separate thing. But everything I said on that video still stands, and it is still definitely, for me, a player in this generation. But we're going to go on to the next system that came out, and it was the PlayStation 2. So, excuse me. If you bear with me for just a moment, I think I'm experiencing the first onset of an incoming cold. So we'll see how I wake up tomorrow. But the PlayStation 2 was big. It's hard to maybe describe just how big the system was when it was coming out. And especially because nowadays, there is so much marketing that's done now on new products, because you're constantly seeing it, right? Like on your phone and on your just everywhere, right? Social media, all the videos that are being done on it, YouTube, and all that, right? And so there's always a lot of exposure, right, to new products that come out, whether they're successful or not, right? That's another thing. But it just seems like there's so much information out there that it has all the chances to be successful, right? As far as like putting its name out there, whether again if it's successful or not, if a product is successful or not, that's a whole different story. But the news, the access information on a product, right, is available everywhere. Back in the late '90s, early 2000s, or even before that, I mean, we had game magazines. At that time in the late '90s and early 2000s, the internet was starting to, blossom, but it was definitely not what it was today. Social media really wasn't a thing back then, and even then, right, even with the lack of like all the different things that we have nowadays, you could just feel the hype of the PlayStation 2. And well, I guess I should say, like, people that if you were in a gamer circle, right? But just the way it was talked about in magazines and all, and just whatever media we had back in the day, right, that would show off what the PlayStation 2 was on its way. there was just like this looming, like, here comes the big boy, right? Like, here comes the first massive player in this new generation of gaming. And the Dreamcast, sure, it was cool, but here comes, the true evolution of video games. And not to talk bad about the Dreamcast, right? Like I said, I already made my video on that. I love that system. Um, but the PlayStation 2 just had this looming presence over the whole gaming industry, right? That it's like almost everyone was like, the next generation doesn't start until Sony starts. And was it this generation or was it in the next one where somebody from Sony says something like it doesn't start until Sony says it does, or something like that. I think it's maybe the next generation. So, but but yeah, you just got this presence, right? That the or feeling, right, that the PlayStation 2 was right around the corner and it was just going to dominate everything. I mean, they were talking about how I think was it George Lucas himself that said it, or somebody said it, right? That the PlayStation 2 was going to be about as powerful, if not more, than the technology behind what was powering the Phantom Menace at the time, right? It was because the Phantom Menace, the Star Wars movie, came out in 1999, and so just again back then when people would say something, it was printed in a magazine. We're not able to dissect it, immediately, right? The way we do things, nowadays, right? Somebody posts something on Twitter, right? There's like all kinds of comments and everything, right? And all that immediately can be disproven or whatever, right? That wasn't the case back then. And so we just kind of took that out like, oh my God, that's going to be so cool. Um, and so there was just this big old, they were talking about the emotion engine, and just again how powerful the PlayStation 2 was going to be. And I was already super impressed with the graphics on the Dreamcast, right? And so I'm thinking, like, how much better can these games really look? Um, and and so that's what the Dreamcast was really, or I'm sorry, the PlayStation 2 was really hyping it up to be, right? Just a very powerful system. But and that was all cool and all, right? And so this part right here, I'm talking about for like the gamer person, right? Because we were really interested in what kind of video games were going to come out in it and all. Ultimately, the PlayStation 2 had a fairly weak launch lineup, but it was still massive, right? The PlayStation 2, everyone wanted it. A big part of the reason for that was because of the inclusion of the DVD player. I will say that I do think that the success of the PlayStation 2, I mean, it's as of now, it's still the highest selling system of all time. For the longest time, it was I think the official numbers were like about 155 million. More recently, just really like a few months ago, Sony came out and said they've sold now a few extra, so now it's at around 160 million. I think is last I saw. Excuse me. Um, but I do think that the quality of the gaming lineup and the variety of the gaming lineup that the PlayStation 2 had was definitely a big reason why the PlayStation 2 succeeded. And I still feel that the library of the PlayStation 2 is still one of the best of all time. It is definitely one of my favorite systems of all time. It's in my top three at least. Having said all that, though, you don't get to a huge number like 155 million without a lot of other things kind of working in its favor. And again, the DVD player was huge because back then, I want to say like on the lower end DVD player price was around $500. And I think the PlayStation 2 was $299, so about 300. So for like, let's go with those numbers there, right? For DVD players, so that's about $200 less than your regular DVD player, and you're getting the PlayStation 2. And so that was a huge, huge selling point for the PlayStation 2. I mean, movies were still a big business, back then. I mean, they still are now. It's just I feel like back then, I mean, not dollar for dollar, but movies were just still had a lot of cultural relevance. And so, and then the DVDs started coming out, and they were looking great. They looked so much better than the VHSs. So that all kind of came together at the right time, where it just led Sony to, for the PlayStation 2 to blow up, and it sure did. I don't know exactly how many of these records have held, but I know that it broke a lot of records initially, right? Whether it feels like the most systems sold in a period of time, fastest selling and all that. But like I said, eventually got to 155 million, and it dominated this generation. If you know, and so I will say this: if you look at this generation just strictly from sales numbers, so if you're a new gamer and you're trying to get into the history of video games and you're just trying to look for like the best of the best, right? And if you're going strictly on sales numbers, you will think, oh, the PlayStation 2 immediately, right? Um, the thing about this generation, though, is that the other systems that I'll show here later were definitely players. I mean, I already talked about the Dreamcast, right? And then the Xbox and the GameCube also. But if you just look at the sales numbers, I mean, you would think that they were complete failures, right, compared to what the Dreamcast or the PlayStation 2 did. And again, right, for Dreamcast, for Sega, it was. For the GameCube, Nintendo did struggle this generation. Microsoft, I mean, I don't know how much of a profit they made for like their Xbox brand, for Microsoft, but I mean, they were relevant enough, right, with some of the things that they did in this generation, but all of them were a far cry from what the PlayStation 2 did. But I will say though that yes, the PlayStation 2 is great, but definitely don't think that the other systems were a failure, because even the Dreamcast, which was considered a financial failure, it left enough of a cultural impact on the video gaming scene that it is definitely worthy of being mentioned alongside the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the Xbox. But anyway, let's kind of get into some of the games now. Let's see. So I don't have the cover for a lot of in this emulator. You can add like cover art in this section here. I believe you have to like download them to your hard drive or in the computer, and then and so there's a lot of back and forth you have to do between the computer and your Xbox. I just haven't taken the time to try to do that, so it's going to look a little bland. But at the very least, you get to see the blue CD color, which was so early PlayStation 2 games came on a CD, and then eventually more of them, for the most part, came out were just basically DVDs. Now the underside of the DVD ones were just your regular kind of silverish, goldish, whatever color, but the CDs though had like this blue color on it. So I thought this was kind of cool, at least that they did this here. For those of us that are too lazy to upload the game covers. But let's see, I'm just going to throw on. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of what I've done before. I'm just playing random games here as I kind of talk about them. And yeah, so just again, I'm not playing through any games right now or anything. This is just to show off some gameplay. But the cool thing about this emulator is that it gives you the little startup logo there, or the startup chime from the PlayStation 2. Not quite as classic as the first one, but still pretty cool. This one here is Tekken Tag, and this game, it was kind of like Soul Calibur, where this also ran, I believe, the System 11. Was it the System 11 or System 22? I forget. But it was a arcade board that was slightly more powerful than the PlayStation, the original one. But when they ported it over to the PlayStation 2, it looked significantly better. So pretty much on par with like what they did with the Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast. But you get this cool little intro here. And this was pretty cool. I mean, it wasn't like it was a tag battle, so it wasn't like a completely new Tekken game, but it was still pretty cool. But so again, the Dreamcast didn't have the PlayStation 2 didn't have the best of launches, and I think I mean, I remember I was so excited to get the PlayStation 2, right? Because again, the hype was just through the roof. And so it came out in about October of 2000, if I remember right. But I didn't get it until would have been around spring or so of 2001. And the launch lineup initially for the PlayStation 2 was fairly lackluster. I mean, you had Tekken Tag, which is cool. You had SSX, which is pretty cool. Um, you had SSX, um, and that game was pretty cool too. Um, but you didn't have a whole lot more. And so when I was looking at the graphics on this, I was like, okay, it looks cool. I kind of like the way Soul Calibur looks more. So, there was a bit of like, okay, that Sony maybe overhyped this feeling at first. Um, but but I think the Sony PlayStation had just garnered so much respect in the previous generation with the original PlayStation that I think everyone just assumed, like, don't worry, the games are coming, right? The good stuff is coming. This is just the initial launch. Sure, it didn't have the best launch, but they already signed games from like Square, Capcom, Konami. The good stuff is coming. And it didn't take too long for the good stuff to come out. Um, um, but yeah, the initial launch though was a bit weak. But again, it wasn't a complete failure. Like I said, Tekken Tag was cool. Ridge Racer 5, that was pretty cool too. Also, um, again, SSX was cool. Or there were several games too also that came out that weren't quite launch titles, but they were pretty close within the launch window. Um, that were pretty cool too, and they kind of got forgotten in time, I feel. But just like some examples here, so like one game I remember I really got into was this one right here, Shadow of Destiny. It's a game from Konami, and it's kind of like a mystery kind of game. Um, I was testing it out the other day again, just because I remember this game, and that I played it a lot back then, but I don't quite recall a lot of like what exactly happens in the game. And when I was checking it out the other day again, it's just like a cool little mystery game. I wouldn't say it's like a horror, survival horror or anything like that. It's just uh, it's kind of hard to describe. But like I said, it's a nifty little game though. Let's see, and the graphics were fairly cool. Um, they were definitely a step up right from the PlayStation. But at the time, I was, Shenmue had been out, and that game came out in what, November of 2020. So a little bit before this game came out. And so if I'm talking about like back then, I guess what we had for like open world games. I was looking at this game. I was like, well, I think I like the look of Shenmue more. um, so again, I wasn't initially too impressed with the PlayStation. Um, but let me know if you played this game. It's I want to play it again. I want, at some point soon, I want to take the time to actually sit down and really go through it again, because it was special. I mean, it was a cool experience. And even though I wasn't too super impressed with the graphics and all, I was impressed with just the overall style of the game, because it was something a little different, right, than what we've been playing before. Um, and so one of those games that just kind of got lost in the early PlayStation 2 days. Um, I think there was a few games like in the sixth generation that just kind of got lost as then the big hitters started coming out. Um, but I think I want to say that there's a version of on the PSP of this game. But yeah, Shadow of Destiny, cool game. That's like a time limit on it. If I remember right, I think it has multiple endings. Um, but yeah, cool game. Like I said, if you haven't checked it out, definitely give it a look. So one thing about this emulator that I've kind of noticed is that for some reason it's been doing this recently, where if I close out of a game, I have to restart the emulator, which is a little bit of a nuisance, but not too bad. But one of the games that I really got into, though, early on in the PlayStation, because let me back up a bit. 2001 ended up becoming a crazy year for gaming, mainly spearheaded by the PlayStation 2. The amount of like games that came out like almost back to back, even to this day, are still considered classics, was pretty mind blowing. Um, and that kind of started um, late summer, um, and then till the end of the year. But a little bit before that, like I said, there were some games on the PlayStation 2 that were coming out, right, that were pretty good. And this is another one here, Twisted Metal Black. I remember having a lot of fun with this game. But up until this point, though, so because let's see, I was playing the PlayStation 2 a lot, but I was playing my Dreamcast a lot too, also, and then also my PlayStation 2, because we had just gotten some really good games right on them. And I remember playing like RPGs, like excuse me, Skies of Arcadia, Grandia 2, and then Final Fantasy 9, still from the previous generation, and the Chrono Cross. Those were my, games I was playing a lot at the time. That games that had a lot of substance to them. But I was jumping over to a PlayStation 2, right? Still playing some games, and this was one here that I remember putting some time into. Um, I always like an arcade style kind of game, but they're not games that I would really dedicate a whole lot of time to, but some of them really just kind of grab my interest. And this one particularly, I did really like. I think what I just really liked was just the very dark tone to it. Like the little story elements are pretty pretty cool. Yeah, Sweet Tooth. Before he was like a cool little mascot for the series. Looked a little creepy, but nothing too crazy. I mean, clowns in general are just creepy, but this version just like, okay, you're pretty demented sicko there. But yeah, this is a good one here, and it's hard as heck though. But it's really fun playing multiplayer. Um, Around this time was where um, I didn't quite have a lot of people around me. A lot of my old friends and all, just we all kind of started moving on. Friends were starting to get married and all that, so I didn't have like just friends that could come over and play games, and all like I did before. So when I got this game, when I had the PlayStation 2 and all, I was pretty much by myself. I lived with my parents at the time mainly, but I didn't really have anyone to play with. There was a few handful of times where I did play this multiplayer with someone, and I had a blast doing it. But because I was just in a place where I had a lot of people around me that would play games, I didn't really get to experience that game that way, um, which kind of sucked, but well, is what it is. Um, but yeah, just definitely one of the cooler like racing combat games. Um, I don't know. I mean, this is one game that um, I feel could definitely use an upgrade. And there's a lot of cool ways I think you can go about it. And it seems like it would be a success, but I think a lot of multiplayer online games now, because you would think that that's where they would want to go with this one. They just seem pretty risky, but at the same time, Sony has made some decisions fairly recently on what kind of games they would want to do live service. And so it's like, okay, if you were taking a risk on one, why wouldn't you do something like this? because this seems to make more sense for those kind of games. But anyways, that's later generation stuff. But for what it was back then, though, yeah, just a really fun game. Um, yeah, and it's cool too because of all the little story snippets that you get in this game. It just made it worth playing for that too, also. So, um, I mean, that's what I liked about this. These past generations is that you would have fun multiplayer, cool single player experiences, and so that way you kind of get the best of both worlds. I miss that a lot. But anyway, yeah, Twisted Metal Black, definitely a cool game. But yeah, so around this time, it I wasn't too super impressed still with the PlayStation 2. But then, like I said, right as the year started going on, the heavy hitters really started coming out, and so we had games like Ico, however you want to call it. Silent Hill 2 came out, around mid 2001 also, which I feel like at the time, Silent Hill 2 didn't quite. Um, I mean, people liked it, but so at the time I was reading Game Informer, and I started reading it around this year, and so I really liked the first Silent Hill, but when this one came out, they gave it, like a 7 or so, right? Excuse me, give or take. But they weren't really too super thrilled about it. And so when I played the game, I liked it. I thought it was cool, but a lot of it went over my head. I was 21 years old at the time. Didn't have, I mean, I had already had some life experience, but not to the extent that obviously I have now. Um, but there seemed to, it's just one of those games that I feel like when people have gone back to it and all, they're like, this was a masterpiece, and I think people just can appreciate it a lot more, as maybe they just get it more now, or I don't know, maybe this kind of game just resonates with people more. Whatever the case might be, this game just seemed to really pick up steam in the later years. But it came out in mid 2001 or so. Um, and I mean, this game is just a classic. Um, this part right here, just. Yeah, this is one game that I have watched so many like videos on, like people deciphering the overall meaning and themes of this game, and you know all the hidden themes and all. And I never get tired of it, just because there's so much depth to this game that I just really love. And the horror stories that I really like is something that, sure, it's scary, but at the same time, just something that really grips you, right, with what it's trying to tell you. And when it's done in a kind of scary way, I mean, it just kind of lingers, right? It's a little unsettling. And that's what, I love horror stuff. And so that's what I just really love about this game. That, like I said, it has a few jump scares. I mean, it's a little scary, but just when you really think about what's going on in this game, the mood of the game, the atmosphere, um, all the hidden meanings behind things, and the overall outcome, the climax of the story, and everything, it's so clever. Um, and a lot of things that I really enjoy, in whether it's movies, games, or what have you, is things that you can just constantly analyze over and over, because it's not everything is spelled out for you, and I love that kind of stuff. I love that kind of stuff. Graphics wise, when I played this, it was another game that I'm like, okay, it looks cool, but doesn't look too much better than the first Silent Hill. At least, like I said, at a first glance, right? Um, so I wasn't still immediately super impressed with the PlayStation 2. I was liking the games, right? I was like, okay, these games are fun. These games are cool. But where's that? power of the next generation, right? That they were really hyping it up to be. At this point, I wasn't quite feeling it yet. It's just such a clever hook to a story. The acting in this game, I at the time, I think I didn't find it too impressive, but as I've gone back to this game and all, I think it suits the game very well. Yeah, just a clever hook. I don't know. I thought the one thing that I did like about this game right away, the world, like that's very that's kind of eerie, right? You know, you were called here by your dead wife. What? You know, um, I thought that was a clever way to start off the game. One thing that this game was still able to do well was the kind of grimy sort of like look to it all, um, which the first one did really well, and I think it took advantage of the limited hardware back then. And even with the more extra horsepower, I still felt they were able to retain that pretty well because it gave Silent Hill a certain style, and the fog effects in this are just amazing. And from what I've seen before, I, I think that they were able to pull this effect off specific to the PlayStation 2 because the PlayStation 2 was a very unique system that it was a bit difficult to program for, but it looks like the developers were able to kind of, however they did this, right? It was a really convincing look because even a more powerful system, excuse me, like the Xbox later, the fog didn't look quite as good. I thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, this little scene right here where you kind of hear like a, is it a dog or whatever it is in the background that seems to be chasing you? You're like, okay, what the hell is that? It's just cool. But yeah, Silent Hill 2 just ended up becoming a absolute classic of the genre of games in general. Um, but at the time, in the moment playing it, I thought it was cool. You know, I was like, okay, cool, right? Um, but I still wasn't completely sold, right? Again, I'm like, you know, PlayStation 2, you're cool and all, but where's the where's the true next gen experience, right? Well, at the time, somewhere around September-ish, maybe October-ish or so, within that time frame, I had let my brother, who was living in another place at the time, borrow my PlayStation 2. And with the arrangement that he was going to bring it back to me during Thanksgiving. So he had it for a couple months. Um, During that time, there was a whole bunch of games that were coming out, right? Um, and I almost regretted, letting him borrow it. Um, but so what ended up happening was because there was like Grand Theft Auto 3, Devil May Cry, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, Jack and Daxter, Metal Gear Solid 2. Um, those are just some that I can name off the top of my head, right? They were coming out, and I was interested in. I want to say that I think I had bought some of them, right? Just knowing that I would get the system back at some point soon, and I could start playing them. But my brother had I think he had bought his own copies too also, but somehow ultimately when he had my PlayStation 2 at the time for those few months, he had played Devil May Cry and Metal Gear Solid 2. And he was like raving about him, like, dude, you gotta see these games, right? And so um Metal Gear Solid 2, I was super hyped about just because, again, I was a big fan of the first one. And, well, Metal Gear Solid, anyways, on the PlayStation. And they were hyping up Metal Gear Solid 2 like nothing else, right? Game Informer at the time, I'd given it like a perfect 10, if I remember right. But before I played Metal Gear Solid 2, I was like, I want to check out Devil May Cry. This game was also getting pretty hyped up. Um, and it was getting some pretty good reviews overall. And I didn't know a whole lot of much about it. I just knew it was some kind of like an action game, right? So I was like, all right, well, let's see what Devil May Cry is all about. And this game ended up being the very first game that I played that I was like, okay, this is next generation. This is kick ass. This is what the PlayStation 2 is all about. I'm just kind of skipping through the cinemas here, but yeah, I mean, right off the bat, right? I'm just looking at these graphics. I'm like, oh my god, this is like, yeah, this is what I'm playing. And again, the 60 frames per second were just mind blowing. And I thought that the detail and the backgrounds and the textures and all that were just really impressive. Dante was just a really cool character. Um, the game, the sword and the guns. I thought that was just really cool. Very anime. At the time, I was getting really into anime. um, there's a little secret here. So if anybody that's never played the game, just kind of jump up here and jump up here, and you get a blue one. And if you get 4 of these, you get your life bar increases. Yeah, but immediately when I was playing this, right, I was like, this feels kind of like Castlevania, right? Um, and so I think at the time I was thinking, like, what are Castlevania games going to look like? But I thought this was so cool here, like you're walking out, right? And just, I mean, the architecture, I think, was what really impressed me on this. Just like, you know, how almost realistic everything looked and the detail to everything. You didn't have like those wobbly, jaggy textures that you would in the previous generation. Everything looked a lot more solid. Well, the PlayStation 2 still had a bit of jaggies on their polygons, but it was nowhere near to what it was in the previous generation. The animation on Dante, just the camera angles, um, the little song that plays in the background, or the just kind of creepy, spooky, mysterious. Um, Almost has like a little bit of a classical sort of tone to it, though, too. Um, yeah, I mean, at this point, right, when I'm playing the game for the first time, I'm like, this is cool. Like, I like this. This is very impressive. But yeah, I mean, it was the PlayStation 2 just was um, had so many cool stuff to it. And Devil May Cry 3 was, I'm sorry, Devil May Cry was just a great game that started opening up the floodgates of all the great PlayStation 2 games. Because, like I said at the time, right? So, um, I checked out Devil May Cry 3. I was sold on it. I was like, this is amazing. This is awesome. Hell yeah. No, we're in the next generation. Um, let's play Metal Gear Solid 2 now. And there's certain games that I've played that after I've beaten the game and all, or even while I was playing the game, I at one point said to myself, I was like, this is the best game of all time. And this was one of them. When I first started playing through this game, I was like, games can't look better than this. They can't be better than this. This is just highly impressive. And I still think Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty is an amazing game. Um, the game can be a little controversial, I should say a lot controversial, because for a lot of different reasons. But I also think that, so at the time when the game came out, at least, so I was mainly reading Game Informer at the time. I would kind of look at EGM and all, but it was mainly Game Informer. And then about a year or two later, I started reading Play Magazine, which was from some of the writers from Game Van. But Game Informer at the time, they were just super hyped on this game. I mean, they gave it like a 10 out of 10, talking it's like the best game ever and all that, right? Which pretty much at the time mirrored my sentiments on the game. And I know that, I mean, with this game, so again, it was people really liked it, but as the years kind of went on, it almost seemed like that initial like, oh my god, shock value to it kind of dwindled some, because a lot of it just had to do where people started to become more vocal about their hate towards Raiden, or maybe not necessarily Raiden completely, but just the fact that you don't get to play as Solid Snake throughout most of the game. And a lot of it has to do probably also because the way it was marketed, I mean, it really led you to believe that you were going to be Solid Snake. I mean, they showed like images and trailers of you playing Solid Snake in later scenes in the game, which eventually you find out that you weren't actually going to play a Solid Snake. And so I think as time kind of the initial release of the game and the initial shock of the game came out, when it came out, kind of, were in the background, people started expressing certain distaste for this game. And I think I started realizing that a little bit more when after part 3 came out. But then as years went on further, because of a lot of the themes of this game, what they talk about, and just how it almost eerily mirrors real world events and things going on nowadays, I think it's gotten like a new boost in popularity. And I think it's just one of those things where Hideo Kojima was just, for me, this is the game that more so than his other games, for me anyways, is he was really like almost like looking into the future and almost prophesizing some of the things that would happen eventually. He might have not even known it at the time, right? He might have just been like, oh, this just sounds cool. But because of his level of detail and his storytelling and his characters and his research and lore and all that stuff, right, that he puts into his games, it really made a lot of people enjoy this game, I feel, more now than ever. And it's become more relevant now than ever because, again, a lot of things of just how it touches on real world politics and such. But yeah, I mean, and at the time, right? I mean, the game looked really amazing. Uh, just this scene right here. Um, again, 60 frames per second was the shit. And I've already kind of mentioned it before in previous videos, but again, it was the shit, right? And also to see it play out with this level of detail in an action game, in a high budget profile game like Metal Gear Solid, was just, I mean, it was the stuff of like, you know, it was just very awe inspiring. I mean, even nowadays, this looks really impressive, like the rain effects and all. I mean, this is, and what's crazy is that with this game, there was a lot of different details, right? That you can kind of, if you take the time to look, you'll really be able to see a lot of it. All right, look at that. You can kind of make out like a little bit of reflections and the shadows and the rain and all. I mean, for back then, for 2001, just highly impressive, and I'm still impressed by this to this day. the animation, yeah, I mean, this game, very quality stuff. But that was just another game, right? In the crazy year that 2001 was. Naughty Dog started doing their thing with Jack and Daxter. That was another big game too at the time. Jack and Daxter, though, I felt that I think it's a great series. I really love the first one. It's one of my favorite 3D platformers of all time. 2 and 3 are good. They kind of went in a different direction. Probably inspired a lot by like Grand Theft Auto. Excuse me. Part 2 is actually one of the games that game was hard. I beat it. It took me a while, but I beat it. It's one of my more better gaming accomplishments. But then I do remember liking Part 3 though a lot because I felt that it wasn't quite as hard. I think I like the kind of more desert Mad Max sort of feel to it more. Um, but um, but this first one though, what I like about it is that it's just more of a traditional 3D platformer, and I think I like it for that. There, if I could jack. This game, I believe you can put in widescreen. So there wasn't a whole lot of games that were doing this, but some of them were. So again, this game would have come out in 2001, and widescreen TVs again weren't too, they weren't the mainstream. I don't think at this time. Can you do? Yeah, okay, yeah. So you can do widescreen. Okay, so it's already widescreen. Okay. So the PlayStation 2 still used memory cards. What was cool about the memory cards, though, of the PlayStation 2 was the little animations that they would do. Like if you go into the menu screen, and depending on the developer, right, sometimes they would put like cute little animations or whatever their little mascot was that they would use to represent the game. Capcom, in particular, I remember had some pretty cool stuff on there. Namco, I think, also too. Um, but yeah, little things like that I kind of miss from the older generation because it just gave like the systems a personality that you just don't see as much nowadays. I do miss that, because it was again one thing with the PlayStation 2 that you're like, well, yeah, sure, the Xbox has a hard drive, but do you have cute little animations? Um, it's little things like that that just and that's what I really liked about this generation was just um, the identity of each system, right? You knew what you were getting to when you got a Dreamcast. You knew what you were getting to when you got a PlayStation 2 and so forth. Um, oh, that didn't look right. Think about emulation. You get like these little graphical glitches, and so sometimes you have to tinker around with some of the settings. See, so I switched it over to this, and it seems to have gotten rid of that little graphical glitch, but now it's pretty much playing it in the native resolution, right, from back in the day, which I guess is more of an authentic deal. So whatever, we'll go with this. So if I haven't said it already before, I'll say it now again. If you are going to mess around with emulators, you have to want to be able to want to tinker a bit. It's just kind of the nature of emulation. Some of them have gotten really good, and then depending on the hardware you're playing it, You can get some really good results without a whole lot of hassle, but a lot of times there is some tinkering you have to do. So just something to keep in mind if you're starting to get into emulation. This emulator, for the most part, runs pretty well. Playing this again on the Xbox Series S, but um, I don't know if I played this game so far on this emulator, but well, we just saw a little glitch there. And it's not the end of the world. I mean, and maybe some people won't mind it, but for some people, it might kind of bug you, right? So, just a heads up. Oh, oops. It's a funny game. And yeah, I mean, there was another area that the PlayStation 2 excelled at was providing those games that were more for everyone, right? Jack and Daxter, Sly Cooper, Ratchet and Clank. I mean, those each one of them had a really great trilogy on the PlayStation 2. A lot of great trilogies on the PlayStation 2. I mean, there was Devil May Cry, 1, 2, and 3. Part 2 kind of gets a bad rep, and I get it. I mean, the game is a little boring. But I think because 1 and 3 are so good, right? You can kind of like, okay, we'll still give part 2 a pass. Where the overall trilogy, right, is worth experiencing. Only 2 God of War games, right? But they were both excellent. Um, Grand Theft Auto. Actually, let's do Grand Theft Auto. But the Ratchet and Clank games, Sly Cooper, Jack and Daxter, uh, Prince of Persia games, and not just on the PlayStation 2, but just the sixth generation in general. Just a lot of cool trilogies. Um, just I'm still blown away by the output of games back then. Like how many games were coming out, right? It's just it's so crazy to me, um, but Grand Theft Auto 3. I mean, I was more hyped for like games like Metal Gear, Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy X, because I've always associated the best games to be Japanese games. That's how it's been for several years. Things were starting to kind of shift a little bit, starting kind of with this year, because some of the big games that we had this year, Grand Theft Auto 3 and Halo in particular, I mean, they gave the industry a different vibe, I mean, they were like, okay, sure, Metal Gear Solid and those games are cool, but check this out though. And I remember when I started playing this game because I played it, I think, a little after Metal Gear Solid 2, and I was like, this is really engrossing. Like, I mean, you know, um, I'd already played Shenmue and that Shadow of Destiny game, which were kind of open world in a way, but not to the extent of like what this game was. Um, and so, yeah, it's, this game just really, really blew things up. Um, when you go back to this one here, it hasn't quite aged that well. Um, but what it set the standard for in open world games, it's definitely one of the most influential games of all time. Um, no doubt. This game was just absolutely huge. A lot of motion blur though in this game. I guess I didn't notice it too much back then, but it's pretty heavy though. I mean, you're just small time. Was this game in widescreen too? Yeah, it was. But yeah, I just remember driving through this, and I was like, "Oh, and I could just go anywhere in the city." Um, it just, I don't know. It made it seem like, because I'm getting that feeling again right now, right as I'm going back to that time. I remember playing with my little Hot Wheels on the my living room floor when I was a kid, and I was just we had like this kind of a design, wood panel design on the floor. And so, to me, in my eyes, I kind of used to pretend that it was like streets and city blocks and all that. And I would just kind of play with my little cars all over the living room floor there, just imagining things and all. And that's kind of the vibe that I got when I played this game at first. I was like, I just felt like I could just do anything, right? And it's highly engaging. I mean, at the time, right? And like I said, right, we never really had this kind of stuff back then. Um, so it just, I think that's why immediately this game just blew up outside of the violence, and all that, right? Which is fun. Uh, but I think also just being able to essentially almost feel like you're living in this world was just quite the experience for us back then. I almost feel it's not in widescreen. I can get lost in just trying to sometimes play around with settings and all, so, which is strange because I I like more the fact that if I can just get into a game and play it, I don't want to mess around with settings too much and all. But I've messed around a little bit with mainly with emulation of some of the handheld PC devices that have come out recently. Um, but I can see why it can be addicting for PC gamers, right, to tinker with their settings and all. It's not my preferred way to want to play a game because I just generally just want to plug and play. But I get it. I think I can understand. Um, but anyways, yeah, Grand Theft Auto 3. I mean, just huge, right? And then the games that followed, Vice City and San Andreas. It was San Andreas, especially, right? I mean, it became the biggest selling PlayStation 2 game, I believe. I mean, by the time we got to that one, this series was just on fire. The fact that we got three of them from the time frame of 2001 to 2004, so what, 3 years? That's nuts. Just nuts. But I had experienced all these games, right? It's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 also. Um, there might be another one too. I can't quite recall, but in 2001. And then to top off the year, because it was Final Fantasy X. I want to say that I had read somewhere that the game was going to come out early 2002. But surprise, surprise, it ended up coming out late in 2001. I think it came out like in mid to late December, if I recall. Because I want to say that I think I saw it at a was it Walmart or wherever I was buying games at the time, and I was like, "Oh shit!" Final Fantasy X is out. Snagged it up right away, right? Um, and I mean, it's just it's just something we don't get so much nowadays, right? But to play games that even to this day are just, in my opinion, just some of the best games of all time. And having played a lot of these games back to back almost, it's um it's hard for a lot of us that used to play games a lot to, that grew up in this generation, to just that how we got away from that. Now I can only imagine how hard games are to make now, everything that it takes to make games nowadays. um but we just got a little spoiled, I guess, back then. We were just getting just crazy good games back to back. um and um I guess it's just kind of what we just thought the expectation was, right? And why so many of us fell in love with this medium. Um, but yeah, Final Fantasy X. Not gonna lie, it can be a bit cheesy at times, but just this little song, this little scene right here. If you played this game, you know. Um, oh man, this game just it's special. I think this is still a song that Nobuo Uematsu did, because he didn't do the whole soundtrack to this. The facial animations, right, were kind of a big thing in this game. I haven't played the PlayStation 2 version in a long time. I've been the more for many years now. The version I've been playing has been the high definition version, and the one thing that they didn't quite get right with the high definition version was the facial models. There's some kind of behind the scenes issues that they had with it, but that's the one thing that the PlayStation 2 one did do better, is the facial animations, or just the look of the characters. They look a little bit more kiddie, I guess, in the new one. They're not bad. It's just they do look a little bit better here in the PlayStation 2 version. And it looks nice. I mean, like, because you can kind of upscale it on this emulator, right? So it's definitely not a bad way to play this game. But God, I mean, what a magical time that was in 2001. Unfortunately, when you get to the actual gameplay of this game, the character models, the quality of them, they do take a bit of a downgrade. Um, Unfortunately, at this time, they were still at a point where they would use a more high polygon, better detailed versions in some of the more key scenes, and just in your just everyday, or your regular scenes, they use less detailed versions, and so they kind of they're not bad looking. It's just that when you first see the high detail models, and you go back to these, you're like, oh man, I kind of want to. I wish they would have somehow figured out a way to use those high polygon models more, or at least in some of the re-releases, right, of this, or that this game has had. No biggie, right? It's just it kind of throws me off a little bit every time I play this game. Like, look at his face right there, right? I mean, it's not the quality of the previous version, or the what you saw earlier in the intro. It's funny because, so, two of my favorite games, right, at this time, and even of all time, but when I played them at this time, Metal Gear Solid 2 and Final Fantasy X, both of them received some somewhat heavy criticism. They were both well liked, right? Like they're, I think for the most part, people consider them like really great games. But some of the heavy criticism that they received against them were the main characters. So in the first one, Raiden, or Metal Gear Solid 2, I mean Raiden, and then Tidus in this one. Um, Mainly because they're kind of whiny kind of characters, and I get it. I get it. Um, but both of them, what I think they have in common, and why I felt that I really was able to get into these stories, is because in both games they're kind of what is it called, fish out of water stories. So like Raiden, um, he's the new he's a rookie agent basically. Or first time out on the field, he's learning right from Snake. So you're kind of playing it through his eyes. Same thing with Tidus. Sure, he's cocky here and he's confident and all that, right? Because he's a blitzball player and all. But then as the story goes on, right, and he's in a place where he's not in his element, kind of the same thing, right? He's asking a lot of questions. He's new to this world, and also you're kind of playing it through his eyes. So even though the characters can seem a little weak, whiny, and all, I think the reason why I got into them both was because of that reason, right? Because you're kind of seeing it through their eyes, right? Like you're experiencing these worlds for the first time through their shoes, and so because of that, I appreciated it, right? I appreciated the direction that both of these games took. Like, years later, like I said, right, or as time went on after these games came out, they were starting to get criticized for that. But oh, I don't. I didn't mind it. I didn't mind it. Tidus does kind of seem a little. I hate to say this because I love the actor James Arnold Taylor. I think he's great. He does a lot of great work, but I don't know. Tidus, he just doesn't for me have the voice of like a jock. You know, I've gotten so used to it now that I have a hard time kind of picturing someone else doing the voice other than Tidus. Um, but uh, but I kind of wonder if what direction it would have went if they would have went with a more, I don't want to say more masculine voice, like not like a deep voice, but just a more like um, I don't know. Picture your typical high school jock, right? Does he sound like Tidus? Not really, right? So I guess that's just the point I'm trying to make. Um, Again, I'm so used to this game now that I have a hard time hearing somebody else's than Tidus. But I'm just kind of curious, right? Like if it would have went a different direction with his voice. But for the most part, the voice acting in this is pretty good. Actually, really good, I think, in a lot of cases. Um, but I think a lot of it also has to do with depending on who the writers are, right? And then also the translators, because this has got to be a very complicated process. But some of the stuff just doesn't quite translate over from Japanese to English that well. And so um, it's just some of the things that they say and all just seem off. But then also the direction that they take. Like if you compare this game to Final Fantasy 12 script and acting, very different, right? Um, and and I think it's because this one takes more kind of anime Japanese um, vibe to it. Like perhaps their sense of humor, some of the jokes, some of the dialogue that they're saying is kind of more Japanese like, just happen to be translated in English. For something like Final Fantasy 12 or even Metal Gear Solid 2 seems to be more, sure, it's translated from Japanese to English, but I think that the writers and all were initially kind of targeting a Western audience. So a lot of the jokes, mannerisms, and all that seems to be already lending more to that to Western audiences. And so I think that's why the translation and the acting just comes across as better. Because a lot of the actors that do the voices for these are very talented. Again, I think it's just the direction that they went to. But like Auron, he's a badass. So he's one of my favorite Final Fantasy characters. I love this part right here. How he holds up that wine flask or whatever that is. It's great. Final Fantasy X, great game. But yeah, the PlayStation 2, I mean, gosh, you can go deep into the library of this game and just get so lost. I want to say there was like almost 4,000 games made for this system. Um, and so I think that's what part of the reason why it makes it one of the best systems of all time, because it wasn't just all crap games. I mean, sure, there was several of them, but a lot of them are really good too also. And you're going to find a lot of hidden gems on here. I mean, the hidden gems list outside of like the main big banger games on this system is just almost endless. At least it feels that way. I mean, I'll kind of go over a few of them here, but like there's Berserk, which was a Japanese game only. Um, but let's see, Chaos Legion, um, Dark Watch, which was also on the Xbox too. Deus Ex, there was a console version here on the PlayStation 2, which is pretty good. Um, Downhill Domination, just a fun downhill bike racing game. It seems kind of silly, but it's really good. I've never played this game. It's kind of like a survival horror. It's all right. But like Forgotten Realms, like check this shit out. The intro to this game, it's amazing. But it's just like I said, you're gonna go down a rabbit hole with like all the hidden gems on this game, on this system, and you have pretty much every single genre covered that you can think of. Um, and I mean, because of that, it's just one of the best systems of all time. And I don't believe it was just because of the DVD player. I feel like because of the DVD player, gave it a huge boost in sales. I won't deny that. But I feel like just the quality and the variety of the games available and the amount of games on this system just truly put it to that legendary status, um, as an entertainment piece, not just a video game console, but just as an entertainment piece of hardware. It's it's one of the best of all time. Um, because again, it was a DVD player and all that, right? And it played some amazing games. I mean, you just had a lot of value when you purchase a PlayStation 2. The access of entertainment that you can get from them was pretty staggering. But like, check this out. I thought this was so cool. The Lord of the Rings movies had already been out, so this kind of style of medieval fantasy was definitely big. I mean, I thought that was just cool. Okay, I forgot how to play this. But it's based on Dungeons and Dragons, to my understanding. Um, I'm not too familiar with Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, outside of like there's dragons, orcs, and things like that. But whatever the case is, though, this game was a fun hack and slash. It was made by the team that actually made the the pretty excellent Lord of the Ring games on these systems. Um, Only this is their kind of take on a more sort of original um, game. I mean, it's because I think this is an original game for the that wasn't, it's Dungeons and Dragons, right? But one of the authors of Dungeons and Dragons, I want to say, I think made the story specifically for the game. Could be wrong, but I want to say I think that was the case. But anyways, I mean, this is one game. I want to make a video, I think, at some point where I want to highlight games that were kind of overlooked games on the main systems, and again, the PlayStation 2. It's kind of a hard one to think of, right? Because again, there's so many of them. Um, Ghost Hunter. This is another great one. Um, see, Maximo. Ghost to Glory was cool, but it was hard. Maximo versus the Army of Zin, which was a sequel, was really good. It's challenging, but it's not super hard. It's very charming. It's a fun quest, but the game just never really took off though. And it's such a great game. Plays really well. It improved a lot, I think, from the first one. It's a little, I don't know. I feel like it's a little disappointing that this game didn't take off too much, or this series. I wish Capcom would do like a re-release of these games somehow. I'm showing this one instead of Ghost of Glory because I feel like Ghost of Glory has some exposure to it, right? But I don't think I've really ever heard of many people talk about this game here. Okay, I have this habit where no matter what, I always go into the settings and it's just kind of like, okay, what can I change? Um, but yeah, if you're collecting, emulating, whatever the case might be, check out these games here. Again, the Maximo games. Um, if you like a difficult game, again, you might like the first one, but it is hard though. Just kind of go into it knowing that. This one is a lot more user friendly. Um, but either way, right? Like I said, both of them are really excellent. But yeah, this one seems to be having some kind of like emulator issue. I thought that was maybe fog, but no, that seems to be kind of more of an emulator issue. See how it kind of goes. Um, but the character models are really cool in this. Now this is a Capcom game, but it was developed by a I think an American studio. Crazy rabbit. Yeah, but probably one of the top games I would recommend for like hidden gems on the PlayStation 2. Maximum. Specifically the sequel. Now the overall hardware of the PlayStation 2, it was I didn't like I don't know. I wasn't the biggest fan of this the look of the PlayStation 2. I mean, it was fine. It has ridges on the side and all, and but I don't know, just something about the PlayStation 2 that I wasn't the biggest fan of the way it looked. I can't even quite explain it to this day. Um, the one that I had for years, it gave me some issues. I do remember getting that discrete error screen from time to time, specifically more with the games that were running on a CD, which I think was kind of a common issue. Um, but other than that, though, at least the one that I had held up pretty well, though. Um, but I never got the slim model. I think my brother did, but I never did. Um, but I like the controllers. The DualShock. I mean, the DualShock overall. Like if I'm thinking about it, if someone were to tell me you can only have one controller, right, um, to play across all systems, which one would you pick? I would probably pick a variation of the DualShock or the PlayStation controller, basically, because I prefer the offset analog sticks. I prefer the D-pad on other systems or on other controllers, but just as an overall package for what you get, um, I think I prefer just like the Sony controller. because like the buttons sometimes on the Xbox, like right now I'm playing on the Xbox Series S controller, and it's a fine controller, and especially for like racing games and first person shooters. But like the D-pad is a little too clicky, the buttons are a little too clicky for me, and so just as an over, and so there's always something that is a little disappointing with most controllers. But the PlayStation One, well, it doesn't necessarily have like my favorite thing about a controller. It's just as an overall package, I feel like it's at least commendable. Um, but anyways, let's see. Oh, I love watching the intro to this game. But yeah, but I had collected so many games on the PlayStation 2. Again, most of the ones that you're seeing here, I had among some other ones, I think. Um, and it was just a fun system to collect for. Although there was a lot of like multi-platform games that I generally went more with the Xbox or even sometimes on the GameCube instead of the PlayStation 2. This was a generation where I started kind of wanting to get the best version of a game that was out because I started kind of geeking out on like because I had a decent TV at the time and a stereo system, and so like most Xbox games, for example, could do progressive scan and they'll be digital. Um, and so usually I went towards those games, right? Unlike the multi-platform games. um, but like the games that I could only get on the PlayStation 2. I mean, like, and even then there was so many games, right? That um, even not including like the multi-platform games to get, like the Onimusha series, right, was another one of them. But yeah, this intro's just awesome. I remember reading in the magazines that the intro to this game was just really spectacular. So I was excited to see it right when I first got this game, and yeah, it didn't disappoint. This is pretty badass. He's like a ninja here because usually the characters that you play in Onimusha, at least the main characters are ninja, or I'm sorry, samurais. But here you're like, oh, so you're a ninja? And at first you're like, who is this? But the choreography of like the fight scene in this is just it's just pretty awesome. And then the detail and the quality of like the CG and all is really impressive too. Definitely probably the best at the time. And it's very epic. Like, what are you on? Like some kind of a big ass bug? Kind of has like some Lord of the Rings aesthetics. Lord of the Rings was huge in the early 2000s. So I don't blame a lot of companies for just kind of mimicking them a lot. But this part here is cool. Oh, here's Seminolski from part one. This is a great series. I'm so glad that. So part one, you can get it on modern consoles. Part two is coming out, which I'm so happy because part two is my favorite one. Um, and that's coming out here soon, so I'm definitely going to buy that one. I hope that this one gets released too, part three, because part three was really good. Um, oh yeah, but this part right here is so awesome. And you're like, come on, tell me that is not badass. That was just so cool. And the game itself is pretty fun. So, and then there's a new one coming out, I think next year, which I'm looking forward to. So, uh, yeah, Onimusha, great game. Again, another trilogy, right? That was just was just cool. I say this because again, right? Just if you're familiar with modern gaming, right, where we just don't have that output anymore. Um, I'm not, like I said, I'm not trying to be a hater or anything. It's just like I said, I think we were just spoiled, like how much quality stuff was just coming out back to back to back, and all. It was just insane. But speaking of trilogies, here's another one too. Xenosaga. I am curious as to how much these games sold. Xenosaga and then Xenogears on the PlayStation 1. And with the popularity of the Xenoblade Chronicles games, to just kind of wonder, is it not worth putting these games out on a re-release somehow? Um, because they're games that are kind of stuck, like the Xenosaga games. Great games. Stuck on the PlayStation 2. There's no other way to play these games. Um, and and it's a shame too, because there's such um, just a very deep storyline. Um, I don't know, maybe they don't resonate that well with some people, and that's why I'm curious, like how because I know a lot of it is a business thing, right? Like okay, like these games have their following, but on a grand scope, realistically, how much money could they make, right? If they were to release them, is it worth it, right? And I don't know like what it costs to like release these games, if it's worth it, like how much would the profits be? I have no idea. I just know that it's just a shame that some of these games are just kind of stuck to these systems. But yeah, this game, I really got into this game. It is it's very cinema heavy. So if you've never played the Xenosaga games, very cinema heavy. I only really played the first one. I played a little bit of the second one. I've kind of very shortly played the third one. Um, but this one I did beat. Um, so if you want to get into these games, it is at least this one I know for sure, is very cinema heavy. But it's still, but again, some games, like I've mentioned before, it's it's if you enjoy a good story, if you enjoy a good experience, if you want to be entertained, um, then it is definitely worth playing. Um, Combat is really good. I like the combat to this game. The story is really good, right? The acting is really good in this game, and also again, if you can appreciate a good sci-fi anime story, you'll definitely love this game. Cosmos to me is one of the coolest characters around. At least in this first one. I don't know how her story arc plays out in 2 and 3. Shion, who I guess you can say is like the main character to the series, she's pretty cool too. Also, and then some of the side characters, they're cool, but I think they're kind of the two standouts. Um, and yeah, just this, at least like I said, this one here, this is a really good game. I only I mean, I beat it, I think, a handful of times back in the day. So this game would have come out in 2002, I think. Um, but yeah, it's cool. The music, I want to say, I think by yeah, God, what's his name? Yasura Mitsura. God, I don't want to misspell it, mispronounce his name, but I'm pretty sure it's the guy from Chrono Trigger. So you're already in good company there with the music, right? But it's basically combo. So it's kind of like you do combos on this in a sense. So it's kind of explaining it there, right? Blah 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 blah. So let's see. I'm gonna do square and then triangle. You can kind of mix up your attacks a bit, and that's what I liked about it. And then depending on the enemy, some attacks work better than others. And then as you build up your combos, right, you can do like more of a special attack too, also. Yeah, I kind of want to play this game again. I forget how cool some of these games are. But yeah, Xenosaga, very cool game. I don't. It's not quite for me. It wasn't quite as deep as Xenogears was, but the story definitely goes places. And also for me personally, I think it's one of the best endings too in a video game. I really love the ending to this game. I thought it was really well done. What's going on in the story, just the music, it's just great. Yeah, really blown away by that ending. Let's see, what else did I want to show here? So Kingdom Hearts, here's another two games that came out on the PlayStation 2. One came out in 2002 and 2006. So back then, 4 years would have been kind of a long wait between sequels. That's crazy, huh? I mean, that was considered like a long wait. Um, yeah, Kingdom Hearts, the first one in particular, I really hold dear. It was just a magical game. I mean, I was already, like I said, I was so from 19. So let's go back a little bit. 1997, Final Fantasy 7. Because again, this is kind of a Tetsuya Nomura sort of you know game. But 2007, Final Fantasy 7, 2008. Oh, I'm sorry, 2000. What am I talking about? 2007. Oh my god, 1997, Final Fantasy 7, 1999, Final Fantasy 8, and then 2001, Final Fantasy 10, and then we get this game. And Tetsuya Nomura, he has a certain style. He's almost kind of like Hideo Kojima, where I think that sometimes their ambition, their overall like scope of what they want to tell can be a little bit too much for them. But at the same time, I feel like they kind of know what's going to impress their fans if you get their storytelling. Now, that doesn't like if you get, and I say that in quotations, their storytelling doesn't mean like you're on some kind of higher level of like you know um, whatever experience or whatever, right? It's just they just have a certain style, and and so they have their fans. They have a lot of haters too, because again, it, it's it's not the most easily digestible stuff that they make. But if you kind of get it, then you get it, and you're along for the weird ride. I'm kind of on that camp because, like I said, right, I really liked the old school like Final Fantasy games, right, from like the artwork more of Yoshitaka Amano. Uh, but once Tetsuya Nomura took over, I mean, I loved it in Final Fantasy 7, but I was a little hesitant about his style with Final Fantasy 8 and even 10. But then I played this game and all, and I was like, I like this guy's style. I do. And I remember at the time I used to draw a lot, and I kind of would try to mimic his style a bit. The very like crazy hair, the kind of just weird outfits and all, but it's just kind of a style. Now, Kingdom Hearts eventually becomes a very convoluted story, um, which I've only played part one and two, and part two is where it kind of gets off the rails a bit. I was still on board with it. I think it's still cool. and I love that game too. Also, Part Two is really great too. Also, um, but uh, but there is a lot that is just very. It's almost like trying to be a little too edgy in its mystery building, where it gives you like these little nuggets of information. It shows you like who's this character, who's this, because it's kind of leading like, is this going to pay off later to something cool? And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, or sometimes it's just like I don't understand what the hell's going on. But I still kind of dig it. I don't know. I kind of do. Um, he has a style. Tetsuya Nomura has a style, and I dig it. Like I said, it's cool. But what I liked about this one, though, Kingdom Hearts, the original one, is that the story was at its simplest. And I think that worked in its favor because while I like Kingdom Hearts 2, and I feel like I could appreciate some of the other games too, even with all the convoluted craziness that comes with it. But if you're talking mass appeal and all, you're having Disney characters in here. And Disney stories are popular because of their simplicity. Not necessarily basic with no substance. It's just that their stories are easily digestible for the mass audience. Like some of their stories have endured for years, right? Like Snow White or Lion King or Aladdin or Sleeping Beauty and all those, right? I mean, they're charming for a reason, and it's because their stories are sure. There's a lot of like, I mean, they have depth to them. It's just that it's easily understandable. I mean, they're made for kids, right? And so when you're doing something with Disney related property like that, um, I think it helped this one, at least for me personally, why this one's my favorite is because the story was still simple enough, where simple and clean, so to speak. Haha, get it? Um, but where it made sense why there's Disney characters in this. In the later games, it's kind of like this is just getting all over the place, like and it kind of didn't fit Disney. If you were a hardcore fan, it did also, but also not, right? At least I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain, right? But I think this is my personal favorite one, and all because the story was still simple enough, and it fit well with a lot of the Disney worlds that you go into. So this is another game where the uh, the character models in the some of the main cinemas just look a lot better than the ones in the regular cinemas. Like right there, right? Like that looks great. But then in some of the regular gameplay, he doesn't quite look as detailed. Uh, Again, not a biggie, but just something to note. I always do soldier and give up magic. I don't know. I just want to play more as a brute berserker, I guess. The music too is so beautiful in this game. Oh, what is her name? Yoko something, I believe, who did the soundtrack to this game. She has a great style that's very Final Fantasy-ish, but also kind of Disney-ish too. She hit the right tone with it. But this song that plays right here is just it takes me back to 2002. It's crazy how music can do that. But yeah, it's I don't know. What do you think of Tetsuya Nomura? Is he just too much, or do you feel like he's like you truly have to get it right to appreciate to the full extent of what he's trying to tell in his stories? All right, this game is still kind of like old school games where you use the left and right triggers to rotate the camera as opposed to the right analog stick. Huh. This game was in 2002 and they still were doing that? That's interesting. You know, developers were learning. I just love like the kind of like the mysterious sort of like fantasy, like I don't know. This game is cool. I really enjoyed this game. I want to say, I don't know. I'd have to look at my overall best games list, but if it wasn't because of Metroid Prime, I think this game might have been my favorite game of 2002. I mean, I really like Grand Theft Auto Vice City, Contra Shattered Soldier. That's another badass game. Um, but this game was cool. I was a little embarrassed when I bought this game because I went to Walmart to get it. I think I got it right after work. I was working a graveyard shift at the time at this one job, and I went into the store, and a friend of, or this guy that was there working at Nally's, the place that I was working at, he was there buying Halo with his Xbox, and I was there buying Kingdom Hearts, and I think he even said something like, "Oh, you're buying a kitty game, huh?" Yeah. But I was like, whatever, but um, yeah, I mean, this is still where Square Enix, that they were to become, were still, in their prime. And while we're talking about that, it does kind of feel right that once they became Square Enix, which would have happened shortly after this, it would have happened shortly after this because it must have happened like in late 2002, 2003, somewhere around that time. Um, and it just kind of feels like the company just kind of changed. Um, because at the beginning of this game, it still said Square Soft. So it must have just happened a little bit after that. It's kind of cool you can get these games on Steam now. The ones on the PlayStation run really well too. Also, you get your 60 frames per second on there. Yeah, I mean, again, it was the PlayStation 2. I think what Nintendo had, and then the Xbox, was that their system defining games that they had were probably more iconic than, say, like on the what you get on the PlayStation 2. For example, on Nintendo, Mario and Link and Metroid and all, I mean, those are pretty iconic, right? And they're great games. Excuse me. And then on the Xbox, well, you got Halo, right? I mean, Halo was huge, Halo, and then especially Halo 2. And so you identify those games with the system. They're system sellers. They're games that you're gonna buy for the most part if you have the system, um, and so they're great exclusives. The PlayStation 2, it it didn't. I mean, there's definitely must-buy games for it, right? It's just that I don't think that the Sony's really ever identified itself with like having a mascot, so to speak, or like its main game. It just had a variety of just a bunch of games on there. Um, that it's like we don't really identify with a specific character, so to speak. We just have like, here's a buffet of games, and they're all really great. Like, for example, On the PlayStation 2, we don't have Mario, you know, but we got Jack and Dexter, we got Ratchet and Clank, we have Sly Cooper, and I mean, those games are pretty good. Um, so, um, excuse me. And then we got God of War. But I think for if there's been a few characters though, right, that have been, you can almost say, right, like they've been kind of mascots to the PlayStation. Kratos, um, he's up there, right, with one of the more popular like Sony characters. This and Part Two were just excellent action games. The way they start out, the fight with the Hydra and all that. I mean, it's just badass. um, I miss these kind of God of War games. Actually, this game, it's right around the 20th anniversary because it came out. So we're in March of 2025. This game came out in March of 2005. So yeah, we're right at the. Apparently, there was some kind of a like an anniversary special that they did for God of War, um, which is cool. I'm glad that they celebrated the game. Looks like we didn't quite get an announcement that we thought we might have, with like maybe a updated version of these games or something. But I mean, whatever. It is what it is. Runs great on emulation here, so I'm not too upset about it. But if we do get it announced here later on, then that'll still be pretty cool. Every God of War game, at least the original ones, would open up with like a very, very epic, cool opening, right? That leads into some kind of a boss fight. So it's kind of like what you kind of were expecting. I mean, all the way from the first two God of War games, the one on the PSP, and then God of War 3. Um, and they all kind of seem to one up each other, at least the console ones. Um, yeah, pretty awesome stuff. Kratos. But yeah, God of War. Kick ass. What was cool around this time too also is that they were starting to release some videos of like behind the scenes of how games were being made, because we never really had that too much before. And I remember seeing the one for God of War, and I thought it was kind of cool, like because it'll the making of the game, it'll go from like so David Jaffe, right, who he's kind of become a I don't know, I guess like a popular controversial figure in the gaming sphere. But back then he was making these games, and so just like when they talk about like his thought process when he was making the game and all, um, it was it was pretty cool. Um, let's see. Oh, I don't have Shadow of the Colossus on this one. Cool. Well, that's what I was going to play next, but I guess not. So let me just kind of, since I don't have that, I'm just going to kind of end on my little final final thoughts on the system here. Let's see. I'll just throw, I don't know, Ratchet and Clank in the background here. Um, but the PlayStation 2 isn't my favorite system of all time. Is or objectively, my personal feelings aside from it, is it the best system of all time? To the first question, if it's mine, not quite. Not quite. And I think a big part of it has to do with just um, it's just missing the Nintendo games, right? Which I mean, obviously, right? Um, but I'll kind of get into what my favorite system is. later on. But it's not quite, it doesn't have the Nintendo games in there and all, obviously. But other than that, though, I mean, the library to this system is just truly, truly exceptional. So then that leads into the next question is this the best system of all time objectively, right? So, like, if someone were to say, okay, I just want one system for all time, um, taking video game history as a whole from the start to where we're at now, what is the best? What am I going to get the most entertainment from? Taking the best from the past, taking the best from the new. Where can I kind of meet in the middle, right, to get the best system of all time? I could definitely make a case for the PlayStation 2. There's one other system that I think would be better, which is a Nintendo Switch. Um, I'll talk about more of that system down the road, but when I think about the PlayStation 2, so its own library of games that are exclusive to the PlayStation 2, at least at the time, right? If we're talking from the time frame from when it came out in the 2000, when it was relevant to like 2000, let's say 2006. No, let's say 2007, because they still had God of War 2 that came out in 2007, right? I mean, fifth generation was already out. I understand that the PlayStation 2 had games coming out, so like almost like what, 2012 or something like that. But let's just say 2007. It had a lot of exclusive games, right? They were exclusive to the PlayStation 2 for a long time on that system up until that day, up until around that time. And it was a lot of games, right? I mean, a lot of quality stuff on there that you can only play on the PlayStation 2. So you have a wealth of games that you can play. You have some of the more mainstream stuff like Mario's, obviously Nintendo. And again, that's just because Nintendo's Nintendo, Sony. But again, you didn't have Mario, but you had Ratchet and Clank, which has kind of become its own legendary series on its own. And if anything, I would say Ratchet and Clank. I would say probably, if I were to think of a mascot for Sony, he'd probably be the closest thing. He wasn't around for the PlayStation 1, but he was on the PlayStation 2, had a great trilogy, and has been around ever since. So my bet would be for Ratchet and Clank as a mascot to the system, or to the brand PlayStation. But so again, you have that aspect of it. You could play DVDs, which again at the time was huge. I used my PlayStation 2. Well, no, I take that back because eventually I got like a 5 disc DVD player because I didn't want to wear out the PlayStation 2, which was watching a bunch of movies because I was watching a bunch of movies during this time too. And so I had a 5 disc carousel DVD player. But for many people, though, right, it was a big deal, right, that you can play or DVDs on it. DVDs were becoming huge. You can watch them in progressive scan, which was 40p, which was the main thing back then until high definition started coming out more like in the mid 2000s or so. So it was a big deal. So you get that extra entertainment value of it, right? That it could play DVD movies. It could play music, which cool, had some online capability. It wasn't as big as the Xbox in that sense, but it had SOCOM, Final Fantasy 11, and a few other games that it was a commendable, I guess, online experience from what it seems like. Um, so you have that to it. Fast forward until now, what can you do with the system? Well, you can mod it in a lot of different ways. Where you can, from what I've heard, you can put your games on a memory card and play them off of that, and it seems to run pretty well. I watched a video about that not too long ago, and I thought that was pretty impressive. I'm almost regretting giving up my PlayStation 2. There's a lot of adapters where you can connect it up to high definition. The one thing about the PlayStation 2, though, that I'll say is this, though, as far as like the graphics, so to speak, and then is back then, so the PlayStation 2 could mainly output 480i, I believe. And even if you were running it on component cables, which at that time were the best you can get, The image quality on the PlayStation, on a lot of PlayStation 2 games, kind of looked a little washed out. Where the image quality wasn't always the best. As the years went on, a lot of games would have progressive scan on it, so it would bump it up to 480p. And so if you had the component cables with the right TV and all, you would see the color to them, right? And now you're like, oh, okay, this looks pretty good. Um, but the image quality on the PlayStation 2 wasn't always the best. Um, it was actually the Dreamcast I felt would get better image quality. So like just something to keep in mind with the PlayStation 2. Um, but again, there's a lot of cool ways, right? You can upscale the games now and all that, right, to try to give it the best image possible. But just kind of know that going into the PlayStation 2, that it didn't have the best image quality, probably the worst, actually out of all the 6th generation systems. But the graphics themselves, as far as like the performance, the polygon count, and all that, right, it was still pretty good. It was the weakest of them all outside of the Dreamcast, but if I think back on like what are the best looking games on this generation, a lot of them are going to be on the PlayStation 2. Like I said, it was no slouch, right? When it came to graphics, it's just funny how like when it was coming out, it was being touted as like the best thing ever, the most powerful system ever, and all. It ended up being like one of the weakest systems of the generation. It's just the way technology was advancing during this time was just insane. Um, but even then, I mean, like if I think of like graphically impressive games, the Ratchet and Clank games, Jack and Daxter, Sly Cooper, God of War, Tekken, the Primal and Ghost Hunter. I remember those games were really nice looking, um, and tons of other games, right? That just look really impressive. Shadow of the Colossus, Final Fantasy 10 and 12. So again, no slouch when it came to graphics. The sound on it, you would get stereo sound, mono sound, obviously. Eventually, a lot of games started supporting uh, Dolby Surround Pro Logic 2, which wasn't quite Dolby Digital, but it still sounded pretty good. Some games, though, did support Dolby Digital. So the PlayStation 2 had it where you connect up like your, regular RC AV cables, like your, back in the day, the typical red and white ones. But it also had a outlet for Dolby, like a digital optical cable. And I remember having it hooked up with that. And there were some games that supported Dolby Digital. I can't think off of the top of my head a game that supported it all the way through. But like a good example though was Metal Gear Solid 2. So it had an option to turn on 5.1 Dolby Digital, but optical, but it would only do it on the cutscenes. So then, because I remember the stereo that I used to have back in the day, the surround sound, and I love that surround sound. It was a Sony 600-watt surround sound system, and the cool thing about it was that so I had it plugged in with the RCA and then also the optical cable, and whenever something would trigger in Dolby Optical, there was a blue little light that would turn on in the front of my receiver, letting me know like, oh, okay, now I'm listening to something in Dolby Digital. Um, and yeah, sure enough, the sound quality was better than say like your Dolby Surround Pro Logic 2. But again, it was very limited on how it was used on the PlayStation 2, I should say. Um, but uh, but yeah, I mean, it was just a killer system, um, and just at a spitballing, I want to say it's my second favorite system of all time because the PlayStation is right behind it. But if I'm looking at the capabilities of the system too, I could play pretty much all PlayStation 1 games on the system too. So, so you take that into account too, and bam, you have two of the best libraries of all time on a video game accessible on the system. Um, it's pretty impressive stuff. Uh, so for that reason, as of right now, I'm going to give it my second favorite system of all time. Objectively, though, maybe maybe the first, if not the second too. But that's all I got for the system now. There's about the PlayStation 2, right? If you're a gamer, you know about the PlayStation 2. so much fun to be had in the system. Um, it was a great time. I definitely was happy to own this system. Um, it was the talk of the town. It's what everybody had back in the day. Obviously, I mean, 155 million. That's a lot of units sold. Um, just just a magical time. I mean, this is just a I just miss these times sometimes in video games. Um, but yeah. Anyways, I'm gonna leave it here. Hope if anything, this gave you a bit of a reminiscing on the system, or maybe potentially write some pointers on what to expect if you do get the system if you've never played it before. Um, it's like I said, this system, because it was a very difficult system to program for a long time. It was hard to emulate. But nowadays, as long as you got a pretty decent PC, the PC SX2, I think is what the emulator is called, it's going to run the games pretty well. Um, on the Xbox Series S, it runs them pretty well. Again, you already saw a little few glitches here and there, right? But for the most part, it runs them pretty well. If you have an Android-based system, so there's two emulators. There's the Aether SX and the Nether XX. So the Aether SX emulator on the Android, it's they stopped development on it. Apparently, there was some issue with the developer, um, but you can still get the latest version of that app online if you search for it. And then some other people took over and they made their own little version of it called Nether SX. Now, between the both of them, because some of them won't run certain games well, like I want to say Sly Cooper, the original one, is one of them where it doesn't run well on Nether SX, but it runs well on Aether SX. But Nether SX tends to run a lot of games a little bit better. So, again, one of the things with emulation, you have to kind of play around with it. But for the most part, though, you're going to get pretty quality emulation if you have at least a pretty, modern PC, an Xbox Series S or X, or a Snapdragon, let's say 865 up and up. You're going to get pretty decent performance from it. So, just something to keep in mind, right? If you're trying to try to get into the games, but you're not looking on spending money, right? Like collecting physical copies. So however you play them, though, there's a tons of stuff in here. You're gonna have fun with the PlayStation 2. But yeah, that's all I got on this one for now. Till the next.